He died at 30. 2. Not in battle, in a bed, in Babylon, with a fever no one could explain, and an empire no one knew how to hold. Tonight is not a story about victory. It is a story about what happens when a man is made by his father, his tutor, his army, and his own mind. To believe that stopping is a kind of death in itself. Whether that belief made him extraordinary or destroyed him is not a question this story will answer. It will only lay the pieces out, slowly, in the dark, and let you sit with them. Find a comfortable position. Let the room go quiet. We begin not with Alexander, but with the world that made him think he could walk to the edge of it. There is a speech that survives from ancient Athens, written by a man named Demosthenes, in which he describes the king of Macedonia as a barbarian, not a rival, not a danger worth addressing in the language of equals, a barbarian from a kingdom on the cold northern edge of the Greek world that most educated Athenians considered rough, peripheral, and not entirely civilized. That word is worth sitting with for a moment, not because it was accurate, but because it was believed, and because the people who believed it were about to be proved wrong in ways that would reshape every map they had ever drawn. Macedonia, in the middle of the 4th century BC, was not a minor place. It had timber that the rest of Greece needed badly for shipbuilding. It had fertile farmland, access to rivers and overland routes connecting the Aegean coast to the interior of the continent, and a population organized around military service for generations. What it did not have was prestige, not the philosophical schools of Athens, not the sacred military reputation of Sparta, not the commercial sophistication of Corinth. In the eyes of the southern states, Macedonia existed at the edge of the Greek world rather than inside it, but the Macedonians themselves did not accept this framing. They worshipped the Greek gods. They spoke a dialect of Greek, close enough to be understood, different enough to invite condescension from the south. Their kings traced their lineage back to Heracles and competed at the Olympic Games, which required Greek ancestry as a condition of entry. The argument about where exactly the circle was drawn, and who had the right to draw it, was one that Philip II inherited along with his throne, and one he never wasted time trying to win through persuasion. He chose a different approach entirely. Philip came to the throne in 350, 9 BC, under circumstances that would have finished a lesser man before he started. The kingdom he inherited was in crisis. His brother, the previous king, had just been killed in battle against an Illyrian coalition from the northwest, a defeat severe enough to destroy a significant portion of the Macedonian army along with him. The northern borders were exposed. Several claimants were competing for the throne with the backing of foreign powers who wanted Macedonia weak and manageable. The treasury was depleted. The army that remained was demoralized. Philip spent the first year of his reign doing something easy to underestimate in retrospect. He survived. He negotiated where he had to, paid tribute where he had to, and bought himself the time to rebuild. That first year is often glossed over in accounts that rush toward his later conquests. But it matters. The qualities Philip demonstrated then: patience, calculation, the willingness to absorb short-term humiliation in exchange for long-term position, were the same qualities he would pass on, in a different and more explosive form, to his son. The military system Philip built over the following decade was genuinely new in ways that are still studied today. The core of it was the Macedonian phalanx, infantry soldiers fighting in tight formation with long pikes called sarissas. Ancient sources and modern reconstructions suggest a sarissa ran somewhere between 15 and 1 feet in length, long enough that soldiers in the middle of a formation could reach past the men in front of them and still meet the enemy line, against conventional Greek hoplite infantry, who fought with shorter spears and relied on the weight of their shield wall. A properly organized phalanx presented a problem that was very difficult to solve. But the phalanx alone was not what made Philip's army different. What made it different was the integration. Philip used the phalanx not as a weapon designed to win battles by itself, but as a mechanism for fixing an enemy in place while his cavalry delivered the decisive blow. The companion cavalry. The elite horsemen who would later become the instrument of Alexander's most famous victories were not a separate force that happened to fight alongside the infantry. They were the other half of a system. The phalanx held. The cavalry broke through. The timing between them and the discipline required to maintain it under the noise and chaos of an actual battle was what separated Philip's army from anything else in the Greek world. He also understood something about soldiers that many rulers of his era treated as an afterthought. An army that is paid regularly, trained continuously, and given a genuine sense of collective identity becomes something different from a seasonal levy of citizens who fight when they have to and go home when they can. Philip's soldiers trained in winter. They marched in formations maintained over long distances on difficult terrain. They developed a loyalty not just to Macedonia as an abstract idea, but to each other, to their units, to Philip personally, and eventually to the institution of the Macedonian army as something larger than any individual campaign. By the time this army was mature, it had defeated the Illyrians who had destroyed the previous Macedonian force. It had secured the northern and western borders. It had expanded east into Thrace and taken control of gold mines near a city Philip would rename Philippi. Mines productive enough to fund continuous military operations. And it had begun moving south into the Greek peninsula with a combination of military pressure and diplomatic skill that left most states unable to decide whether Philip was a partner or a predator until it was too late to answer either way. Demosthenes understood earlier than most. His speeches, a set of orations known as the Philippics, warned Athens repeatedly that Philip was not a barbarian king looking for plunder but something more dangerous, a patient, methodical ruler using every instrument available to him, military, diplomatic, financial, and propagandistic. To make himself the dominant figure in the Greek world, Athens did not listen quickly enough, or decisively enough, or with enough unity to make a difference. In 330, 8 BC, at a place called Chaeronea in Boeotia, Philip's army met a combined force of Athenians and Thebans and defeated them in a battle that effectively ended the era of independent Greek city. State politics, the sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit of 300 soldiers that had never been broken in battle, was destroyed almost entirely at Chaeronea. Ancient sources report that when Philip walked the battlefield afterward and found their bodies still arranged in formation, in the positions they had held when they died, he wept. Whether that story is true is impossible to verify. What is verifiable is what Philip did next. He did not sack Athens. He did not humiliate the city or strip it of its institutions. He made a settlement firm enough to establish Macedonian dominance and generous enough to avoid turning every Greek state into a permanent enemy. He organized a coalition, the League of Corinth, with the stated purpose of launching a campaign against the Persian Empire, the power that had burned Athens a century and a half earlier and whose wealth dwarfed anything the Greek world could imagine on its own. Philip did not live to lead that campaign. In 330, 6 BC, at a wedding celebration at the Macedonian capital of Aegae, he was assassinated. The killer was a Macedonian nobleman named Pausanias, and the exact reasons behind the assassination, the personal grievances, the possible conspirators, have been debated by historians ever since without resolution. What is not debated is the consequence. Philip died, and the kingdom he had built, the army he had trained, the coalition he had assembled, and the campaign he had planned all passed to a 20-year-old who had been watching and learning and waiting. Alexander had been born in 350, 6 BC. The same year Philip received what ancient sources describe as 3 pieces of news arriving in a single day. News that his general Parmenion had won a battle in the north, news that his racehorse had won at Olympia, and news that Olympias had given birth to a son. The sources that record this, writing generations after the fact, present it as a sign of destiny, The tradition may be embellished. Most such traditions are. What is recorded more reliably is that Philip took his son's education seriously in a way that went beyond simply providing tutors. He brought in Aristotle, the most significant philosopher of the age, to teach Alexander personally. He brought Alexander into military campaigns early, giving him experience and responsibility at an age when most kings' sons were still being shielded from consequences, and he seems to have made a decision, somewhere in the course of raising this particular child, that the heir to Macedonia would not simply inherit a kingdom, he would be prepared to do something with it. The kingdom Greece did not take seriously had become, by the time Philip died, the most powerful military force in the Greek world. The man who built it was gone. The man who would take what Philip built and carry it further than Philip had probably imagined was now king. He was 20 years old, and he had inherited not just an army and a treasury and a coalition waiting to move east, but something harder to see and harder to measure: the absolute certainty, instilled by everything he had witnessed and everything he had been told, that the world had underestimated his family once. The appropriate response to that underestimation was not resentment. It was proof. There is a valley in northern Greece, inland from the Aegean coast, where Philip established a small settlement for a specific purpose. He wanted a place removed from the noise of the court, away from the politics of Pella and the competing voices of advisors and generals, where his son could be educated without distraction. The place was called Mieza. The tutor he brought there was Aristotle. What happened at Mieza? Over the course of roughly 3 years, beginning around 340, 3 BC, was not simply that a smart boy received lessons from a famous philosopher. What happened was that 2 entirely different ways of understanding the world were placed inside the same young mind, and neither one ever fully won. Aristotle was, at the time Philip invited him to Macedonia, already recognized as one of the most significant thinkers of the age. He had studied at Plato's Academy in Athens for nearly 20 years. He catalogued animals. He analyzed political systems. He wrote about rhetoric, ethics, memory, and what the soul might be. He brought to Mieza a particular kind of mind, one that believed the world had an order that could be studied, described, and worked with. That knowledge was preparation for action, that a man who understood the world as it actually was, not as he wished it to be, was better equipped to move through it. What Aristotle gave Alexander was not a set of rules but a habit of mind, the habit of asking what something actually is before deciding what to do about it. Ancient sources suggest Alexander developed genuine interests in medicine, botany, geography, and the customs of foreign peoples under Aristotle's influence. The curiosity that would later lead him to bring scientists and surveyors and historians on his campaigns, men tasked with recording what they saw rather than simply fighting, traces back in some part to those years at Mieza. Aristotle also gave him a deep relationship with one book, the Iliad. Homer's account of the siege of Troy and the rage of Achilles was the foundation of any Greek education. But Alexander's relationship with it went beyond standard reverence. Ancien sources, including accounts preserved by Plutarch and referenced by Arrian, describe Alexander keeping a copy of the Iliad annotated by Aristotle himself under his pillow alongside a dagger. The image is striking not just as an anecdote but as a statement of what Alexander believed about himself, that the world of the Iliad was not a remote mythological past but a live set of possibilities, a standard that could be matched and perhaps exceeded. Achilles was the figure Alexander returned to again and again, not simply because Achilles was brave, but because Achilles had made a choice the Iliad presents without fully resolving, the choice between a long, quiet life and a short life of such intensity it becomes immortal in the telling. Everything in Alexander's behaviour, from the moment he took the throne to the last plans he was making in Babylon, suggests he had thought carefully about that choice and had made it. Aristotle gave Alexander a world of order, classification, and careful inquiry. Philip gave him something else entirely. Philip was present not as a tutor, but as a constant example of what power looked like when exercised by someone who understood it completely. What Philip demonstrated every single day was that the world does not arrange itself according to any principle of justice or reason, that it responds to force and the credible threat of force, that ideals only exist if there is strength enough to protect them. Where Aristotle gave Alexander a world that could be known and worked with, Philip gave him a world that had to be taken. 2 teachers, 2 worlds, neither one ever reconciled inside him, and Alexander never chose one over the other, which is perhaps the most important thing to understand about what Mieza produced. The contradiction is visible in everything he did across 2 decades of campaigning. He demonstrated, in the same campaign, sometimes in the same week, a capacity for patient systematic thinking alongside a willingness to take physical risks that no systematic thinker would endorse. He spared cities that submitted and destroyed cities that resisted. With a consistency that reflected careful logic, he also rode into battle at the front of his cavalry, personally, in a way that got him wounded multiple times and made no rational sense for a commander who could not be replaced. He spoke of liberating people and he enslaved Thebes. He valued Greek culture above all others and ended up ruling an empire that was mostly not Greek. He was, by the end, genuinely difficult to categorize, which is perhaps exactly what 2 irreconcilable teachers had made him. Among the boys educated alongside Alexander at Mieza was a young Macedonian nobleman who would remain closer to him than any other person for the rest of his life. His name was Hephaestion, not a general at first, not an advisor, but the person Alexander seems to have trusted with things he did not share with the others. The person who had been there since the beginning, since before the Hellespont, since before any of it. He is worth naming here, early in the story, because he belongs to the beginning of it. What his presence ultimately meant to Alexander will become clear much later, in a city called Ecbatana, when the campaign had already given everything it had to give. The years at Mieza ended. Alexander returned to court and Philip began including him in the actual work of the kingdom. At 16, with Philip away on campaign, Alexander served as regent of Macedonia, not a figurehead, but an actual regent with authority to deal with whatever arose. What arose was a rebellion by a Thracian people called the Maedi in the northeast of the kingdom. Alexander led the campaign himself, suppressed the rebellion, and founded a settlement on the site that he named, with the self-assurance of a teenager who had apparently never been taught to doubt himself. Alexandropolis. It was the first city he named after himself. It would not be the last. At 18, he fought at Chaeronea alongside his father, commanding the companion cavalry on the left flank in the engagement that destroyed the sacred band of Thebes. Ancient sources credit him with the decisive charge that broke the Theban line. Whether that credit is fully accurate or shaped in retrospect by later knowledge of what Alexander would become, the sources cannot entirely settle. What they agree on is that he was there, that he commanded real forces, and that the battle went the way Philip needed it to go. He was being prepared. Everything was preparation. The question that would only be answered after Philip's death was what exactly he had been prepared for, and whether the man who emerged from Mieza and Chaeronea, from Aristotle's ordered world and Philip's brutal one, from the Iliad and from years of watching power exercised at the highest level, was capable of something more than simply repeating what his father had built. The answer came quickly, and it told you almost everything you needed to know about the kind of king he intended to be. Philip II was killed in the summer of 330, 6 BC. The setting was a celebration, a wedding at the royal palace at Aegi, and the assassination happened in public, in daylight, in front of an audience gathered for something entirely different. The killer was a man named Pausanias, a Macedonian nobleman who had previously served in Philip's bodyguard. He ran Philip through with a short sword as the king entered the theatre where the celebration was being held. Philip died almost immediately. Pausanias ran for the horses and was caught and killed before he could reach them. Whatever he knew about his reasons, or about whether anyone had encouraged him, died with him. Ancient sources offer several possible explanations for Pausanias's motive, most involving personal grievances against Philip or members of his court. Whether those explanations are accurate, whether there were additional political motivations, whether anyone else was involved in organizing what happened that day, these are questions the ancient sources raise without resolving, and that historians have debated for centuries without reaching consensus. What is not debated is the immediate consequence. Philip was dead. Alexander was king. He was 20 years old, and the situation he inherited was dangerous from almost every direction at once. Inside Macedonia, there were potential rivals to the throne. A young and untested king was an invitation for anyone with an alternative claim and enough support to move quickly. Outside Macedonia, the news of Philip's death travelled fast, and the reactions it produced were not expressions of grief. Thebes, which had a Macedonian garrison stationed in its citadel as part of the post, Chaeronea settlement, began organising to expel it. Athens, where Demosthenes had spent years warning about Macedonian power, responded to the assassination with a public vote of congratulations to the killer. The Greek city, states that Philip had organised into the League of Corinth, began testing the edges of the arrangement, calculating whether the obligations they had accepted from Philip were obligations they owed to his 20-year-old son. In the north, Illyrian and Thracian peoples that Philip had spent years subduing began to stir. The advance force Philip had already sent across the Hellespont was operating without clear direction. The Persian Empire took note of the change and recalibrated its expectations. Alexander's response to all of this revealed something that would define every campaign he ever ran. He moved faster than the situation seemed to allow. The first thing he secured was Macedonia itself. Potential rivals were dealt with quickly and without sentimentality. Ancient sources record that several claimants with blood ties to the throne were eliminated in the weeks following Philip's death. The speed and thoroughness of this was not unusual by the standards of ancient succession politics, where leaving a living rival was generally understood to mean leaving a future rebellion. But the absence of hesitation is worth noting. He was 20 years old. He had just lost his father, and the first political decisions he made as king required ordering the deaths of people he had known his entire life. He made them without any recorded sign of difficulty. The second thing he secured was Greece. He marched south within weeks of taking the throne. The speed of his arrival was itself a message. The city, states that had been calculating how much room Philip's death had created, found the new king standing in front of them before their calculations were complete. Thessaly submitted. The Amphictyonic Council recognized his position. Athens, which had voted congratulations to Philip's killer only weeks earlier, sent an embassy of congratulation to Philip's son. The League of Corinth was reconvened. Alexander was confirmed as its leader. The tone was that of a conclusion rather than a negotiation. The city, states understood that the Macedonian army was present and that Alexander intended to be recognized. They recognized him. One city held out, Thebes. While Alexander was dealing with rebellions on Macedonia's northern borders in 330, 5 BC, a rumour reached Greece that he had been killed in the fighting. The rumour was false, but in Thebes it was believed eagerly enough that the city moved against the Macedonian garrison in its citadel, laid siege to it, and declared that the era of Macedonian dominance was over. Alexander was very much alive, and he moved south from the northern frontier with a speed that startled everyone who had assumed the rumour was reliable. He arrived at Thebes before the city had finished deciding what to do about the fact that he had arrived. He gave the Thebans an opportunity to stand down. They did not take it. The city fell quickly, and what Alexander decided to do afterward was not quick in its consequences. He gave the decision about Thebes to the League of Corinth, specifically to representatives of other Greek states, many of whom had their own grievances against Thebes from earlier conflicts. The League voted to destroy the city. The population was to be enslaved, the buildings demolished. Only temples and the house of the poet Pindar, who had written in praise of Macedonian kings, would be left standing. The destruction of Thebes in 330, 5 BC sent a message across the Greek world that required no translation. It was not the message of a king, uncertain of his position, or willing to negotiate his authority. There is a question worth sitting with here. one that does not have a comfortable answer. The people of Thebes who were enslaved were not only the people who had decided to challenge Alexander's garrison, they were an entire city, merchants, priests, families, people who had no meaningful say in the decision their leaders had made. The destruction of Thebes was militarily effective and politically rational by the standards of its era, and it was also a catastrophe for tens of thousands of people who had not chosen it. Ancient sources, including Arrian, note that Alexander later expressed regret about Thebes, that he came to see it as having gone too far. Whether that regret was genuine, or whether it developed only after the political situation no longer required that level of example. Setting, the sources cannot tell us. What they do tell us is that the regret, if it was real, did not undo what had been done. This pattern, of a decision that was effective and excessive at the same time, of a man who could not find the point where enough was enough, appears here for the first time in his own reign. It will appear again, in different forms, in different places, across the years that follow. The northern campaigns that preceded the crisis at Thebes demonstrated the same quality in a way that is easier to see because the stakes were lower. When Illyrian and Thracian peoples moved in the aftermath of Philip's death, Alexander marched north immediately, conducted a campaign that covered extraordinary distances in a short time, crossed the Danube River with an improvised crossing that surprised the peoples on the other side, and returned having secured the northern borders within a single campaign season. The crossing of the Danube is a footnote in most accounts, but it reveals something important about the impulse driving the decisions. He crossed not because it was strictly necessary, but because the peoples on the other side believed he would not. The crossing was a demonstration, a message delivered not in words but in movement. I go past the point where you expect me to stop. That impulse surfaces here, at the Danube, in 330, 5 BC. It will surface at Granicus and Tyre and the Hindu Kush and the walls of the Malian city, and each time it surfaces, the story asks the same quiet question. At what point does the refusal to recognize a limit become the limit itself? By the end of 330, 5 BC, Alexander had secured Macedonia from internal rivals, stabilized Greece through rapid military presence and the devastating example of Thebes, and been confirmed as leader of the League of Corinth. He had done all of this in less than 2 years. He was 21 years old. The army was assembled, somewhere around 40,000 soldiers by the estimates. Most historians consider reasonable, though ancient sources vary, and precise numbers from this period should be held with some humility. The treasury was equipped with enough resources to begin the campaign, though not enough to sustain it indefinitely, which meant the campaign would need to pay for itself as it went. He would not see Macedonia again. The crossing of the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia, took place in 330, 4 BC. Ancient sources record that as his ship approached the Asian shore, Alexander threw his spear into the ground from the deck. He was the first to leap ashore. Before the campaign began in earnest, he went to Troy to make offerings at the tomb of Achilles. The man he had been reading about all his life was buried on Asian soil. Alexander had come to the same ground. He was about to find out whether he was the person he had been raised to believe he was. The army that crossed the Hellespont in 330, 4 BC was not, by the standards of what Alexander would later command, an enormous force. Ancient sources put the number at somewhere around 7,000 to 40,000 men, a figure most modern historians treat as reasonable, while acknowledging that precise troop counts from this period are difficult to verify. What mattered was not the size of the force, but its quality and its organization. Philip had spent 2 decades building an army that trained year-round, that operated as an integrated system rather than a collection of separate units, and that had developed an institutional identity strong enough to survive the death of the king who created it. Alexander inherited that army, and in the spring of 330, 4 BC, he led it into Asia. The Persian Empire waiting on the other side was, by almost any measure, the largest and most powerful political entity in the known world. It stretched from the Aegean coast of Asia Minor in the west to the edges of what is today Afghanistan and Pakistan in the east. It controlled Egypt. It controlled Mesopotamia. It had a population that dwarfed anything Macedonia or Greece could field, a treasury that made Philip's gold mines look modest, and a military tradition tested against every major power in the ancient Near East. It also had a problem not immediately visible from the outside. The current king, Darius III, had come to the throne only a few years before Alexander crossed the Hellespont. Darius was not simply the incompetent coward that later tradition sometimes made him, but he was a king who had not yet consolidated the kind of personal authority over his satraps and generals that would have allowed him to respond to Alexander's invasion with a fully unified force from the beginning. The satraps of Asia Minor did not wait for Darius to organize a response from the imperial center. They assembled their own forces and moved to meet Alexander near the Granicus River, in the northwestern corner of Asia Minor. In the early weeks of the campaign, the Persian force at Granicus included a significant contingent of Greek mercenaries, professional soldiers who understood Macedonian tactics well enough to have specific ideas about how to counter them. Their commander, a Greek mercenary officer named Memnon of Rhodes, proposed a strategy that had genuine military logic behind it. Rather than meeting Alexander in open battle, Memnon argued for a scorched earth approach. Withdraw, destroy the crops and supplies of the region, deny Alexander the resources he needed to sustain his army, force a campaign that could not pay for itself to run out of momentum before it reached anything that mattered. The Persian satraps rejected it. They arrayed their forces on the far bank of the Granicus River and waited. The Granicus presented a genuine tactical problem. The river was not enormous, but its banks were steep and uneven, the current fast enough to disorder a formation crossing it, and the Persian cavalry was positioned to strike the Macedonian forces while they were still in the water. Before they had a chance to reform into effective fighting order, several of Alexander's senior commanders, including the experienced General Parmenion, advised waiting until the following morning to attempt a crossing. The conventional wisdom of the time suggested that crossing directly into an established defensive position was unnecessary risk. Alexander crossed immediately. The decision is worth examining not just as a military choice, but as a statement about how he understood the campaign. The men watching, both his own soldiers and the Persian forces on the far bank and the Greek cities of Asia Minor waiting to see what happened, were forming their first impressions of what kind of commander Alexander would be. A delay, even a tactically sensible one, sent a message. It said that Alexander would wait when the situation was not ideal, and he had apparently decided, before the campaign began, that this was not the message he intended to send. Stopping, even briefly, carried a cost he was not willing to pay. The crossing was chaotic and costly. Ancient sources describe fierce fighting in and along the river, with Persian cavalry pressing the attack against the Macedonians as they climbed the steep far bank in disorder. It was in this fighting that Alexander came very close to the kind of end that would have made tonight's story very short. Arrian, whose account of Alexander's campaigns is considered among the most careful of the surviving sources, records that a Persian nobleman named Spithridates came up behind Alexander during the river fighting and struck him with a battle axe. The blow hit Alexander's helmet and cut through it. A second blow was already coming when a Macedonian officer named Clitus, who commanded a unit of the companion cavalry and was the brother of Alexander's childhood nurse, cut Spithridates down before it could land. That moment at the Granicus River in 330, 4 BC is the kind of detail that history tends to pass over quickly in its eagerness to reach the larger story. But it is worth pausing on. Alexander was 22 years old. He had been king for less than 2 years, and the entire story of the decade that followed, Issus and Gaugamela and Persepolis and the Hindu Kush and India and Babylon, everything that happened after 330, 4 BC, came down in that moment to the speed of one man's arm against another. Clitus saved Alexander's life at the Granicus. Alexander would later kill Clitus in a drunken argument in 320, 8 BC, a killing he reportedly understood immediately as unforgivable. The relationship between those two events, the life saved and the life taken, is one of the more painful threads running through the story of Alexander's later years. The Macedonians fought their way across the Granicus, and the battle turned decisively once they established a foothold on the far bank. The integrated system Philip had built began functioning as designed. The Persian cavalry, effective in the river fighting, was less suited to the kind of coordinated engagement the Macedonian phalanx and companion cavalry could deliver on open ground. The Greek mercenaries who had advised against the battle found themselves isolated after the Persian cavalry broke, and were surrounded. Alexander's treatment of those mercenaries was harsh and not strictly required by the military situation. He ordered them killed rather than accepting surrender, a decision that appears to have been partly political, a statement aimed at the Greek world that fighting for Persia against the leader of the League of Corinth carried consequences that ordinary mercenary employment did not usually involve. Later in the campaign, his treatment of Greek mercenaries in Persian service became more pragmatic. As the supply of men willing to fight him shrank, and the value of absorbing skilled soldiers into his own force became apparent, the victory at Granicus opened Western Asia Minor. In the months that followed, Alexander moved along the Aegean coast, accepting the surrender of cities and framing his campaign as the liberation of Greek-speaking people from Persian rule. The framing was partly genuine and partly strategic. It gave the campaign a narrative that made it easier for Greek soldiers and Greek cities to support, and harder for Persian propaganda to counter. One city, Miletus, chose to resist and was taken by siege. Another, Halicarnassus, put up a more substantial defence, partly because it was now defended by Memnon of Rhodes, whose advice had been rejected before Granicus, and who demonstrated what he was capable of when given the chance to actually fight. The siege was prolonged and costly. Memnon eventually evacuated by sea rather than allowing himself to be trapped. Taking the core of his forces with him, Alexander took the city but not Memnon, which would prove significant later. By the end of 330 for BC, Alexander controlled most of Western Asia Minor. He had won the first major engagement of the campaign in a way that told the Persian Empire something important about how he intended to fight. He would press forward. He would accept risk that a more cautious commander would avoid. He would not stop to consolidate when movement was possible. There is a line that runs from the decision to cross the Granicus immediately, against the advice of his most experienced general, to the crossing of the Danube the year before, to the walls of the Malian city years later, to the desert of Gedrosia on the way home. It is the same line each time, the same refusal to recognize a boundary as a boundary simply because someone else had decided it was one. At Granicus, that refusal won a battle and very nearly ended the campaign before it began. The story of what it cost, in other places, at other times, has not yet arrived. Memnon of Rhodes died of illness in 330, 3 BC, during a naval campaign in the Aegean that had been going well enough to cause Alexander genuine concern. His death removed the one Persian commander who had consistently understood what Alexander was doing and had a credible plan for countering it. With Memnon gone, the strategic initiative shifted back to Darius III himself, who decided the time had come to bring Alexander to a decisive engagement. The encounter that resulted near the town of Issus in the autumn of 330, 3 BC, was shaped more by geography than by either commander's preference. Darius had assembled a large force and moved to cut off Alexander's supply lines from the north, positioning himself behind the Macedonian forces as they moved south along the coast. This meant the battle took place not on the open ground that would have suited Darius's numerical advantage, but in a narrow coastal plain hemmed in by mountains on one side and the sea on the other. The terrain at Issus was, for Darius, almost as bad as terrain could be. He had gathered a force that ancient sources describe in numbers modern historians treat with considerable skepticism, ranging from figures too large to be operationally credible down to more conservative estimates. Whatever the actual size, the mountains and the sea narrowed the battlefield to a width that prevented him from using most of his force effectively at any given moment. His cavalry, which should have been able to outflank the Macedonian line, had nowhere to operate. Alexander understood what the terrain meant and acted accordingly. His battle plan was built around the phalanx holding the centre, creating a stable line that would not collapse under Persian infantry pressure, while the companion cavalry, under his personal command, drove at the gap between the Persian centre and their left flank. If the cavalry could break through and turn toward the Persian centre from behind, the battle was over. The phalanx held. The cavalry broke through, and Alexander drove directly toward Darius himself. What happened next is recorded differently by different sources, but the essential fact is not in dispute. Darius left the battlefield. Whether he departed in the kind of panic that the more hostile ancient sources suggest, or conducted a tactical withdrawal when it became clear his position was untenable, as a more measured reading might offer, the result was the same. The Persian king was gone, leaving behind his camp, his treasury, and, critically, members of his own family. His mother, his wife, and his daughters had accompanied the campaign and were captured when the Macedonians took the Persian camp. How Alexander treated the captured Persian royal women is one of the episodes ancient sources use most consistently to illustrate his capacity for genuine magnanimity. He reportedly treated them with respect, allowed them to maintain the ceremonial status appropriate to their rank, and assured Darius's mother that her family's honour was intact. The ancient tradition records that Darius's mother, upon first meeting Alexander and Hephaestion together and bowing to Hephaestion as the taller of the two, was mortified when she realised her mistake, and that Alexander told her she had not been wrong, because Hephaestion was also Alexander. The story may be shaped by the tradition that transmitted it, but it captures something real about how Alexander understood the relationship between military victory and political legitimacy. Humiliating the Persian royal family would have been easy and personally satisfying and strategically destructive. Treating them well cost nothing, and demonstrated to every Persian nobleman watching that submission to Alexander was not the same as disgrace. He was building a story about himself alongside the campaign itself, and he understood that the story mattered as much as the battles. Darius did not accept the result of Issus as final. He sent proposals to Alexander offering territory, a ransom for his family, and, in one version recorded by Arrian and attributed to the general Parmenion, everything west of the Euphrates River as the formal boundary of a settlement. Parmenion is said to have told Alexander that he would accept those terms if he were Alexander. Alexander is said to have replied that he would too. If he were Parmenion, the exchange, whether it happened exactly as recorded or has been shaped in the retelling, captures the essential disagreement inside the Macedonian command. Parmenion thought in terms of achievable objectives and manageable risk. Alexander was a commander who had not yet decided where the campaign ended, and was not inclined to let Darius's offer define it for him. This is the moment where the thesis of tonight's story becomes visible in the decisions themselves, rather than just in the character of the man making them. The war for Persia. By any definition, the men who joined the campaign in 330, 4 BC would have recognized, was effectively within reach of conclusion. The Persian king had fled. The Western Empire was under Macedonian control. A settlement was on the table, and Alexander did not take it, because taking it meant deciding that this was the stopping point, and the man who had thrown his spear from the ship before he even touched Asian soil, who had made offerings at Achilles' tomb before the first battle, who had crossed the Granicus when every experienced voice around him said to wait, had not built his sense of the campaign around the idea of a stopping point. He had built it around the idea that the campaign would not stop until it had reached somewhere that could not be gone past. He declined the settlement. He moved south, toward Egypt. The 2 years between Issus and the next major engagement with Darius were not quiet years. Alexander took the Phoenician coast, which mattered because Phoenician cities were the backbone of the Persian navy. He conducted a difficult siege of Tyre, a city built on an island offshore that had never been taken by a land army, that lasted 7 months and required the construction of a causeway from the mainland to the island that ancient sources describe, and that archaeological evidence broadly supports. He took Gaza after another siege. He entered Egypt, where the Persian governor surrendered without serious resistance. In Egypt he visited the oracle at Siwa, an oasis deep in the western desert, and received a response that ancient sources treat as significant to his self: understanding. Though its content was not fully revealed even to his closest companions, he founded the city of Alexandria at a site on the Mediterranean coast, the most successful of the many cities he would found, and the one that would bear his name most durably. He was in Egypt when Darius wrote again, offering his daughter in marriage and everything west of the Euphrates as the formal boundary of peace. Alexander did not think it was enough. He moved east, toward Mesopotamia, toward Darius and the army that Darius had spent 2 years rebuilding. The two armies met again at a place called Gaugamela, on a plain east of the Tigris River. In the autumn of 330, 1 BC, the contrast with Issus was immediate and deliberate. Darius had learned from Issus that terrain had cost him the battle before it started. At Gaugamela, he chose a wide-open plain and spent time before Alexander's arrival, having it cleared and levelled, removing obstacles that might impede the movement of his cavalry and his scythed chariots. Vehicles fitted with blades extending from their axles designed to cut through infantry formations. He had assembled a force substantially larger than what he had fielded at Issus. He had cavalry from across the empire. He had the ground he wanted. This was a completely different problem from Issus. At Issus, the terrain had done much of Alexander's tactical work for him. At Gaugamela, Darius had removed the terrain as a factor. Alexander would have to fight on a plain designed to maximize Persian advantages, against a force that had had 2 years to prepare, with nowhere to hide the weakness of his numbers. The approach that had worked at Issus could not simply be repeated. It had to be rebuilt from the same principles for a completely different set of conditions. What Alexander did at Gaugamela is still examined by military historians as a genuinely sophisticated tactical response to a genuinely difficult situation. He angled his line to the right as the battle began, drawing the Persian left flank into an extended pursuit that created a gap in the Persian centre. He drove the companion cavalry through that gap directly at Darius himself. The same essential logic he had used at Issus, but executed on different ground against a different disposition of forces. Darius left the battlefield again, but the outline does not capture how close the battle came to going differently. While Alexander was driving at Darius, Persian cavalry on his left flank broke through the Macedonian line and attacked the camp in the rear. The Macedonian left, under the command of Parmenion, came under severe pressure and, according to some ancient sources, sent an urgent message to Alexander asking for support. Alexander had to decide, in the middle of a cavalry charge aimed at the Persian king, whether to continue toward Darius or turn back to relieve his own left flank. He continued toward Darius. Darius left. The Persian forces that had broken through the rear, learning that their king had gone, lost cohesion and began to withdraw. The battle ended as a Macedonian victory. Though the casualties in the fighting on the left flank were not trivial, the comparison between Issus and Gaugamela is not simply a comparison between two battles. It is a comparison between two completely different problems that required two completely different solutions and produced the same result. At Issus, geography had neutralized the opponent's advantages before the fighting began. At Gaugamela, Alexander found the one tactical sequence that worked against an opponent who had specifically prepared the ground to prevent it. When the same essential approach produces a decisive result in two completely different conditions, that tells you something real about the quality of the thinking behind it. But there is something else sitting underneath Gaugamela that is worth naming directly. At the moment when his own camp was under attack, when his left flank was in trouble, when the tactically defensible choice was to respond to the developing crisis, Alexander did not respond to the crisis. He continued toward the single point of pressure he had identified before the battle began, and he did not allow what was happening around him to change the calculation. The decision worked, and in the historical record it looks like genius. But the quality that made it genius at Gaugamela, the absolute refusal to be diverted from a chosen course regardless of what is happening around it, regardless of what the developing situation is asking for, is the same quality that would cost lives in the desert of Gedrosia, and that would make it impossible for him to hear what his army was telling him at the Hyphasis River. The genius and the flaw were the same thing. They had always been the same thing. After Gaugamela, Darius fled east. Alexander entered Babylon without a battle. He went to Susa, where the treasury of the Persian Empire held wealth that staggered the Macedonians who catalogued it. He went to Persepolis. The conventional war against the Achaemenid centre was effectively broken. Darius was still alive and still nominally king. But he was a king without a capital or a treasury or an army, moving through his own empire with a diminishing group of followers. What Alexander chose to do next is a question tonight's story will sit with in the part that follows. Persepolis was not the administrative centre of the Persian Empire. That was Susa. It was not the most commercially important city. That was Babylon. What Persepolis was, and what it had been for nearly 2 centuries by the time Alexander arrived there in the late winter or early spring of 330 BC, was something harder to replace than administrative function or commercial value. It was a symbol, the ceremonial heart of the Achaemenid dynasty, the place where Persian kings were crowned and buried, where the great stone terraces and columned halls announced to anyone who approached them that the people who built this were the rulers of the world. Alexander entered Persepolis and secured its treasury immediately. The numbers that ancient sources give for the treasure at Persepolis are large enough that modern historians treat them with varying degrees of skepticism. But the general picture, of wealth sufficient to fund Alexander's campaign many times over, is consistent across multiple independent sources and broadly credible. He stayed at Persepolis for several months, one of the longer stationary periods of the entire campaign. And what happened during those months is a question the ancient sources address in ways that are striking precisely because they disagree. And then, sometime in the spring of 330 BC, the great palace complex at Persepolis burned. This is the event that the ancient sources cannot agree on, and the disagreement is significant enough that it has occupied historians for centuries without resolution. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC and drawing on earlier sources now lost, gives a detailed account. In his version, the fire was set deliberately, at a celebration that had moved from the dining hall out into the palace complex, on the suggestion of a woman named Thais, an Athenian companion of one of Alexander's generals. Thais argued that it would be fitting to burn the Persian palace as an act of vengeance for the Persian burning of Athens during the invasion of Xerxes. A century and a half earlier, according to Diodorus, Alexander was persuaded. The torches were lit, the fire spread, and the palace burned. Arrian, whose account of Alexander's campaigns is generally considered the most careful of the surviving sources for the military history of the period, gives a different picture. Arrian mentions the burning, but does so briefly and with less certainty about the details. He records that Alexander later regretted it and considered it a mistake. The way Arrian writes about it suggests something less controlled, less ceremonially decided, than the detailed scene in Diodorus. Plutarch, writing his life of Alexander primarily from the perspective of moral character, includes both the story of Thais and the note about Alexander's later regret. He treats it as an episode that reveals something about Alexander's relationship with excess and about what celebration becomes when it is not contained. These are not minor discrepancies. The question of whether the burning of Persepolis was a deliberate political act, a calculated symbolic revenge for the Persian destruction of Athens, or the result of a celebration that got out of control, a decision made in drink that the sober morning revealed as a catastrophic error, changes how you understand Alexander at this particular moment in the campaign. If it was deliberate, the burning was the final punctuation on the Persian War, a piece of theatre designed to tell the Greek world that the debt of Xerxes had been paid in full. There is political logic to that reading, and it has defenders among modern historians. If it was an accident born of excess, it tells a different story. It tells you that by 330 BC, after 3 years of continuous campaigning, the man who had crossed the Hellespont with such calculated intent was capable of destroying the most symbolically important building in the empire he was ostensibly claiming as his own. The regret that multiple sources record suggests he understood, when he was sober, exactly what had been lost. The honest answer? which the sources make unavoidable, is that we cannot know with certainty which version is true. The source that provides the most detailed account is not the source considered most reliable for the specific military and political history of the campaign. The source considered most reliable is the most reticent on this particular event. This is a genuine historical problem, not one that can be resolved by reading the sources more carefully. It requires a decision about which account to trust. And that decision reflects assumptions historians bring to the sources rather than conclusions. The sources themselves compel. What can be said with confidence is this: the palace burned. The most spectacular ceremonial monument of the Achaemenid dynasty was destroyed. And in later years, when the sources record Alexander expressing regret, it is Persepolis that comes up as the thing he wished he had done differently, more consistently than Thebes, more than any other violent decision of the campaign. That regret does not tell us whether the fire was deliberate or accidental, but it tells us something about the contradiction at the centre of what Alexander was trying to build. He was not simply a destroyer passing through. He was trying to become the legitimate heir to what he had taken, to present himself not as a conqueror who emptied things out, but as a ruler who continued them. The fire at Persepolis, whatever its origin, cut against that project in a way that could not be undone. You cannot burn the ceremonial heart of a civilization and then straightforwardly claim to be that civilization's continuation. That contradiction between the fire and the claim, between what he had done and what he was trying to become, would follow Alexander east through every year that remained of the campaign. The further east he went, the more urgently it would demand an answer, and the answer he reached. In the territories of Bactria and Sogdia and India, would cost him in ways he had not fully anticipated when the torches were lit or the celebration went too far. Whichever it was, Darius III was still alive, moving east with a diminishing force and an empire dissolving around him. Alexander followed. The pursuit of Darius would not end with a battle, it would end with a murder, committed by his own Bactrian satrap, a man named Bessus, who had decided that a living Darius was more of a liability than a dead one. When Alexander found Darius in the summer of 330 BC, he found him abandoned by the side of a road, already dead. Ancient sources record that Alexander covered Darius's body with his own cloak. Whether the gesture was genuine mourning or calculated politics or both, it was also a statement. The Persian king was dead. Alexander was his avenger. Bessus, who had murdered his own king, was now a criminal rather than a rival claimant. The long shadow of Persepolis stretched east with him. The war for everything beyond it was about to begin. East of Persepolis, east of the Persian heartland, east of the roads that connected the great cities of the ancient Near East to each other and to the Mediterranean world. The terrain changed in ways the Macedonian army had no frame of reference for. The soldiers who had crossed the Hellespont in 330, 4 BC, had grown up in a world organized around the Aegean Sea, a round city, states and trade routes, and the kind of geography that fit inside a Greek mental map of the known world. They had marched through Asia Minor, which was different from Greece but comprehensible in its general structure. They had fought in the flat plains of Mesopotamia and in the river valleys of the Persian heartland. Terrain that was foreign, but that still offered the essential precondition for Macedonian military success: the possibility of a decisive engagement on ground where the integrated system could function as designed. What lay to the east and northeast offered no such precondition. The pursuit of Bessus took Alexander into Bactria and Sogdia, the regions that correspond roughly to modern northern Afghanistan and parts of modern Central Asia. These were not places that appeared on any Greek map with accuracy. They were the edge of the known world as the Greeks understood it, and in some respects they were beyond it. The distances alone were staggering by ancient standards. From the Persian heartland to the Oxus River, the great waterway that served as a rough boundary between the satrapy of Bactria and the steppe world beyond it, was a march of hundreds of miles through increasingly difficult terrain. The army that made that march in 330 BC and 320, 9 BC was not the fresh, provisioned force that had crossed the Hellespont. It was an army that had been in continuous operation for 4 years. The men were experienced in a way that raw recruits could not match, but they were also tired in a way that 4 years of campaigning produces, and that no amount of victory can entirely remedy. The mountains of this region, crossed in winter campaigns that ancient sources describe as involving cold and altitude, and supply failures that killed men who had survived every battle of the previous 4 years, were not enemies that could be defeated by cavalry or phalanx. They were simply there, and the army crossed them anyway. In conditions that would have halted a force less thoroughly committed to following wherever the man at the front was willing to go, Bessus was captured in 329 BC, not through a decisive battle but through a betrayal by his own subordinates. He was handed over, treated according to Persian custom for those who had killed a king, and eventually executed. The threat he represented as a rival claimant to the Persian throne was eliminated, and then the real problem of the East began, because Bessus was a figurehead for something that did not disappear when he was gone. The territories of Bactria and Sogdia were not organized in the way that the Western Persian satrapies had been organized, with administrative centers and roads and hierarchies of authority that could be taken over by simply replacing the man at the top. They were organized around local strongholds and local leaders who owed their primary loyalty not to any imperial center, but to their own clans and their own networks of obligation. When Alexander took the main city of the region, the local leaders did not surrender with it. They retreated into their strongholds and waited. The campaign that followed, across 329, 328, and 327 BC, was unlike anything the Macedonian army had previously encountered. There were no set peace battles. There were raids on supply lines. There were fortresses perched on cliffs requiring sieges under conditions of cold and altitude. There were stretches of territory that submitted when the army was present and resumed resistance when it moved on. There was a Sogdian leader named Spitamenes who conducted a campaign of a sophistication and persistence that embarrassed the Macedonian forces sent against him repeatedly, ambushing supply convoys, attacking isolated detachments, and withdrawing before a larger force could be brought to bear, only to reappear somewhere else. Spitamenes was eventually killed, again through betrayal by his own allies rather than through Macedonian military action. But the manner of his death did not change what his campaign had demonstrated. The further east Alexander went, the less his army's considerable strengths in set. Peace battle translated into the kind of durable control that the word conquest implies. The Macedonians could win every engagement they were able to bring about and still find that the territory they had supposedly taken remained fundamentally ungoverned by any authority they recognized. This required adaptation, and the adaptation Alexander attempted was more radical than simply adjusting tactics. He began marrying local elites into his administration. He recruited Bactrian and Sogdian cavalry into his own force, not simply as auxiliaries, but as genuine units with their own organization and their own officers. He founded settlements intended not just as military outposts, but as centers of administration and in some cases of genuine habitation that would leave marks on the landscape persisting long after the campaign was over. He also did something that his Macedonian companions found increasingly difficult to accept. He began adopting Persian and Eastern customs in ways that went beyond administrative pragmatism. He wore Persian dress more openly. He introduced elements of Persian court ceremony, including the practice of proskynesis, a bow or prostration performed before the king that was standard in Persian court culture, but that Greeks and Macedonians associated with the worship of gods rather than the greeting of men. When he attempted to introduce proskynesis to his own court, the reaction from his Macedonian companions was fierce, and the attempt was abandoned. The most public opposition came from a man named Callisthenes, a Greek who had been brought on the campaign to record its events, and who was also the nephew of Aristotle. Callisthenes argued that proskynesis was philosophically inappropriate, that it conflated the honours due to gods with the respect owed to men. The argument was grounded in exactly the kind of reasoning Aristotle had taught at Mieza, and it landed exactly as badly with Alexander as anything that reminded him that Aristotle's world and Philip's world had never fully reconciled inside him. Callisthenes was later arrested in connection with an alleged conspiracy against Alexander's life. A conspiracy whose details the ancient sources record in ways that do not fully agree with each other. He died while in custody, though the precise circumstances are not clearly established by any single reliable account. What can be said is that the man Aristotle had sent to record Alexander's achievement did not survive the Eastern campaigns, and that the line connecting Mieza to Maracanda to Callisthenes' death is one of the more troubling threads in the entire story. Now let the story slow down, because the Eastern campaigns had another quality, beneath the battles and the rebellions and the court politics, that matters for understanding what Alexander was becoming. The land itself was doing something to the army that no Persian force had managed. It was wearing them down not through defeat but through repetition, through the sheer accumulation of distance and cold and mountains that had no names in any Greek geography, of rivers that did not appear on any Greek map, of enemies who did not stay still long enough to be defeated decisively. The soldiers who had been young men at Granicus were no longer young. The men who had joined the campaign with a sense of its endpoint, with the idea that Persia was the destination, and once Persia was taken the campaign would be over, had watched that endpoint move east every year for 4 years, and now it was moving east again, into India, toward an ocean that Alexander believed was close and that nobody in the army had actually seen. Something was changing that could not be unchanged, not in the military situation, which remained broadly under control, but in the relationship between Alexander and the army, in the gap that had been opening, slowly and then less slowly, between the king and the men who had been with him since the Hellespont. The Eastern campaigns also produced 2 episodes of violence that the ancient sources treat as particularly significant, not because of their scale, but because of who was involved and what they revealed about what the years of campaigning had done to the man at the centre of it all. The first involved Philotes, the son of the general Parmenion and the commander of the Companion cavalry. In 330 BC, Philotas was accused of having knowledge of a plot against Alexander's life and of failing to report it. He was tried before the Macedonian army, as was traditional for capital cases in Macedonian custom, and executed. The ancient sources disagree significantly on whether Philotas was genuinely guilty of what he was accused of, and the question has not been resolved. What followed immediately after his execution was more unambiguous in its nature. Parmenion, who was in Ecbatana commanding the supply and communication lines, and who had not been accused of any involvement in any plot, was also killed. Messengers were sent ahead by fast horses, so that the news of his execution arrived before the news of his son's death could reach him through other channels. Parmenion was the most senior general in the Macedonian army. He had served Philip for decades. He had been at Chaeronea. The killing of Parmenion without trial, without accusation, was understood by many in the Macedonian command as something qualitatively different from the execution of Philotas. It was the act of a king who had decided that his own security mattered more than the conventions governing how Macedonian kings treated Macedonian noblemen. That understanding settled into the army quietly. It would not fully surface until the Hyphasis River. The second episode was more intimate and more immediately disturbing. In the autumn of 320, 8 BC, at a city called Maracanda in Sogdia, Alexander killed Cleitus the Black, who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus. It was at a banquet where the drinking had gone on long enough that the conversation had moved into territory that sober men would have navigated differently. Cleitus made remarks that questioned Alexander's achievements, that emphasized Philip's role in making the conquests possible, that challenged the image Alexander was constructing of himself as something beyond an ordinary Macedonian king. Alexander became enraged. Men at the banquet tried to restrain both of them. The situation escalated past the point where restraint was possible. Alexander killed Cleitus with a spear. The ancient sources record what happened next with a specificity suggesting the memory was preserved carefully because it was so disturbing to those who witnessed it. Alexander immediately understood what he had done. He tried to turn the spear on himself and was prevented by his bodyguard. He spent the following days in his quarters in a state of grief and apparent collapse that required his senior companions to eventually tell him, with considerable bluntness, that the army needed its king functional. He emerged from his quarters and he continued the campaign. That is the fact that sits most heavily at the centre of the Cletus episode. He killed the man who had saved his life, a companion since before the Hellespont. And then he continued, not easily, not without grief, but he continued. The campaign had become something that could absorb even this, something that could keep moving even when the person inside it had done something he himself recognized as unforgivable. The capacity to continue, regardless of the cost of continuing, was present in Alexander from the beginning. At the Granicus, it was an asset. In the eastern campaigns, it was becoming something harder to name, something the army felt without being able to articulate, something that had to do with the growing weight of a suspicion that the campaign would not stop because the man leading it could not stop, and that the difference between a campaign with a purpose and a man who had made not stopping the purpose itself was beginning to matter in ways it had not mattered before. By 320, 7 BC, Bactria and Sogdia were as controlled as they were going to be. The campaign prepared to enter India. The army had been marching for 7 years. The world they had started in was so far behind them that it existed mostly as memory. The world ahead of them, as far as anyone in the army could determine, was without limit. Alexander believed the ocean, the great sea that Greek geographical thought imagined surrounding all the land in the world, was not far to the east. If they could reach it, the campaign would have a natural boundary, a place where even he would have to stop, because there would be nowhere left to go. They moved into India, and what waited for them there was not the ocean. The story of how Alexander met Roxana begins with a rock, not metaphorically, an actual rock, a fortified position in the highlands of Sogdia that the sources call the Sogdian Rock, a place considered so naturally impregnable that its defenders reportedly called down from the walls to ask whether Alexander's soldiers had wings. The garrison holding it was led by a Bactrian nobleman named Oxyartes, one of the local leaders who had been resisting Macedonian control across the region, and the position he had chosen was, by any reasonable military assessment, extremely difficult to assault from below. Alexander found men who could approach it from above. He called for volunteers who knew how to handle ropes and rock faces in the dark, offered substantial rewards, and by the following morning had a small force of climbers positioned on the heights overlooking the fortress. Looking down at the defenders who had asked about wings and now had their answer, the Sogdian rock fell. Oxyartes was among those taken. In the days that followed, at a gathering where the captives were present, Alexander encountered Roxana, the daughter of the man whose fortress he had just taken. Ancient sources describe her as having caught his attention in a way that the sources themselves cannot fully explain, or perhaps cannot fully agree on. She was not a queen. She was not from one of the great Persian noble families. She was the daughter of a regional Bactrian lord whose fortress had just surrendered, and Alexander married her. This is the moment the ancient sources handle in ways that reflect the different purposes those sources were serving. Arrian, generally the most restrained of the major sources on personal matters, notes the marriage and attributes it to something he describes in terms suggesting personal feeling rather than pure calculation, while adding that it was considered appropriate in any case given how it would help consolidate Macedonian authority in the region. Plutarch gives a more elaborate account emphasizing the personal dimension, describing Alexander as moved by Roxana in a way that preceded any strategic calculation. Diodorus Siculus treats it primarily as a political act, noting its strategic value without dwelling on what it may have meant beyond that. The honest position, given what the sources actually provide, is that both dimensions were almost certainly present, and the proportion between them is not recoverable from this distance. A reading that insists the marriage was purely political goes past the evidence in one direction. A reading that insists it was purely personal goes past it in another. The sources do not permit certainty about the interior life of a man who died more than 2,000 years ago, and the marriage to Roxana is one of those episodes where that limitation is most honestly acknowledged rather than argued around. What can be said is that the political logic of the marriage was real and substantial. Oxyartes became, after the marriage, one of Alexander's reliable administrators in the East, a man with a personal reason to want the Macedonian project to succeed. Other Bactrian and Sogdian leaders who had been watching drew conclusions from the marriage that a purely military relationship would not have produced. In a region where 3 years of hard campaigning had produced control that was partial at best, the marriage accomplished things the phalanx could not. What can also be said is that Alexander's behaviour toward Roxana over the following years does not read like the behaviour of a man who made a calculated political arrangement and considered the matter settled. He did not set Roxana aside when the campaign moved on. He did not treat her as one administrative decision among many. When he later took additional wives at Susa in 320, 4 BC, as part of the mass wedding that was one of the more extraordinary events of his later reign, Roxana retained a position that the sources suggest was genuine rather than merely ceremonial, and when she gave birth to Alexander's son after his death in Babylon, the fact of that pregnancy and that child carried consequences that everyone around her understood as enormous. Whether any of this tells us what Alexander felt is a question the sources cannot answer with confidence. What the sources give us is behaviour over time, and Alexander's behaviour toward Roxana across 6 years is consistent with a relationship that mattered to him in ways that exceeded administrative convenience. The effect of the marriage on the Macedonian army is a subject the sources approach less directly, but that becomes visible in the accumulation of tensions that marked the years after Sogdia. The men who had marched from Macedonia had complicated feelings about the eastern direction of Alexander's reign that extended well beyond the specific question of Roxana. The adoption of Persian dress, the attempt to introduce proskinesis, the marriage to a Bactrian woman rather than a Macedonian or Greek noblewoman, the recruitment of Eastern cavalry into the army, the appointment of Persian and Eastern nobles to positions that had previously been Macedonian. These were not separate irritants. They were cumulative evidence, to many in the Macedonian command, that the campaign had become something different from what it had started as. Philip had organised the League of Corinth for a specific purpose, to punish Persia for the burning of Athens and to liberate the Greek cities of Asia Minor. That purpose had been accomplished years ago. Darius was dead. The Persian treasury had been taken. The great cities of the empire were under Macedonian control. By any definition of the campaign that the men who joined it in 330, 4 BC would have recognised, the war was over. The fact that Alexander did not recognise it as over, that he kept moving east when the logical stopping point had been reached and passed, was something the army had absorbed without open rebellion for years, because Alexander kept winning and because the rewards kept flowing. But the eastern campaigns had changed the calculus. 3 years in Bactria and Sogdia had produced not the decisive victories and clear territorial gains that the earlier years had delivered, but an exhausting, grinding struggle against an enemy that refused to stand still and fight in the way the Macedonian system was designed to defeat. The men had watched Parmenion killed without trial. They had watched Clytus die at a dinner party. They had watched Alexander introduce court customs that felt, to soldiers who had grown up with specific ideas about the relationship between a king and his companions, like a rejection of what they were and where they had come from. The marriage to Roxana was, for many of them, one more piece of evidence for a conclusion they were drawing, slowly and without pleasure. The king they were following into India was not entirely the king who had stood with them at the Granicus. India, in 320, 7 BC was, to the Macedonian army, as unknown as anywhere they had been. Greek geographical knowledge of the subcontinent was fragmentary and often inaccurate. What Alexander understood was that India was rich, that it had cities and kingdoms worth engaging, and that somewhere to the east, if the Greek cosmological model was correct, lay the ocean that bounded the world. If he could reach the ocean, the campaign would have its natural end, a place where he would have to stop, because there would be nowhere left to go. He crossed the Hindu Kush again in the spring of 320, 7 BC, and moved into the Indus Valley. The kingdoms of northwestern India that lay in his path responded in ways that ranged from submission to fierce resistance, and Alexander responded in kind. The Battle of the Hydaspes River, fought against an Indian king named Porus in 320, 6 BC, was by many accounts the hardest military engagement of the entire campaign. Porus had war elephants. The Macedonian horses had never encountered elephants, and could not be trained out of the instinctive fear response that the scent and sound and size of the animals produced. The river was in seasonal flood when Alexander arrived. The battle that followed was won, but at a cost in Macedonian casualties, notably higher than the earlier major engagements. After the Hydaspes, Alexander allowed Porus, who had fought against him with genuine courage and skill, to continue ruling his kingdom as a subordinate ally rather than removing him from power. When asked how he wished to be treated, Porus reportedly said that he wished to be treated as a king. Alexander treated him as a king. The gesture reflected something visible throughout the Eastern campaigns, that submission, offered genuinely, was rewarded in terms that local rulers could recognize and work with. It also reflected a practical reality. Alexander could not garrison every territory he took with the force he had. The choice to preserve functional local rule under Macedonian authority was not charity. It was governance by a man who had begun thinking about what it meant to administer an empire rather than simply to conquer one. Whether he had begun thinking about it early enough, or clearly enough, or with enough of the campaign still ahead of him to act on what he understood, is a different question. Beyond the Hydaspes, the army continued east. The monsoon arrived. Rain fell in quantities that the Macedonians, raised in the comparatively dry climate of the Mediterranean world, found extraordinary and relentless. The ground became difficult. Supply became complicated. The further east they went, the less certain the intelligence about what lay ahead became, and the more the men who had been marching for 7 years found themselves measuring the distance back against the distance forward to an ocean that no one in the army had actually seen. The army was approaching the Hyphasis River in the Punjab region of what is today northwestern India. Beyond it, according to the intelligence Alexander had gathered, lay more kingdoms and more armies and more territory before anything resembling the ocean. The calculation that had sustained the campaign for 7 years was becoming harder to sustain against the evidence of the monsoon and the mud and the faces of men who had been making the same calculation since the Hellespont and were not able to make it any longer. The marriage at the beginning of this part of the story and the river at the end of it are connected by more than chronology. Roxana represented the eastern turn that the campaign had taken. The moment when Alexander's relationship to the lands he was crossing became something more complicated than a conqueror passing through. The Hyphasis was where the army's answer to that complication became impossible to ignore. Something was ending, not with a battle, not with a defeat, but with the slow, inevitable arrival of a question the army had been carrying for years and was now, at last, going to ask out loud. The Hyphasis River is generally identified by historians with the river known today as the Bees, flowing through the Punjab region of northwestern India. In the summer of 320 Cs BC, it was the eastern boundary of everything Alexander's army had reached. Beyond it, according to the intelligence he had gathered, lay more kingdoms, more armies, more territory. Beyond that, further east still, lay what Alexander believed to be the ocean. He wanted to cross. The army did not. What happened at the Hyphasis is described in the surviving sources with enough consistency across Arrian, Plutarch, and Diodorus to give a reasonably clear picture of the events, even if the exact words spoken and the precise sequence of decisions cannot be recovered with certainty. Alexander called an assembly of his senior commanders and told them his intention to continue east. The response he received was not what he had encountered at any previous point in the campaign. Coenus, one of his most experienced and trusted generals, spoke on behalf of the army. The speech that Arrian attributes to him is one of the more remarkable passages in the ancient record of the campaign, not because of its rhetoric, but because of what it says plainly and without apology to a man who had never been told no by the institution he commanded. Coenus told Alexander that the men were exhausted, that they had been campaigning for 7 years, that they were far from home, that many would never see home again, and that the ones still alive wanted the chance to try. He told Alexander that the army that had crossed the Hellespont no longer existed in the form it had then, that the men who remained were older and tired and had given everything they had, and were being asked to give more, indefinitely, toward a goal that kept moving east, no matter how far east they marched. He asked Alexander to stop. What followed in the actual moment before Alexander responded is not fully recorded. What is recorded is his reaction. He told the assembled commanders that he found their reluctance unworthy. He invoked the example of Achilles, of Heracles, of the heroes who had pushed beyond what ordinary men were willing to endure. He told them that the ocean was close, that the boundary of the world was within reach, and that to stop now was to leave the campaign permanently incomplete. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke in support of crossing. The silence of the assembly was itself a message. And it was a message of a kind Alexander had never received from his army before. He dismissed the assembly. He gave them time. He called them back. The response was the same. The army had made its decision without making a formal declaration, without revolt, without the kind of confrontation that would have required Alexander to respond with force. It had simply, collectively, quietly, refused. Ancient sources record that Alexander then went to his tent and did not come out for 3 days. Arrian says he would not admit anyone during this period, not even his closest companions. Plutarch records that he eventually performed divination, seeking signs about whether the crossing should proceed, and that the signs were unfavourable. Whether Alexander consulted the omens because he genuinely believed in their authority, or because they gave him a way to accept the army's refusal without appearing to have capitulated to it, the sources cannot say. Both readings are possible. With Alexander, they often were. What happened after 3 days is described by multiple ancient sources. Alexander announced that the signs were against crossing. He would turn back. But he would mark the eastern limit of the campaign with a monument. 12 enormous altars erected on the bank of the Hyphasis, one for each of the 12 Olympian gods, so that future generations would know how far the Macedonian army had reached. The army responded to the announcement with something the sources describe as celebration and weeping simultaneously. Men coming to Alexander's tent and calling out blessings on him. The emotional release the sources describe is consistent with what you would expect from men who had been waiting for 3 days to learn whether the king they were following into what felt like the end of the world had finally heard them. The altars were built. They have never been definitively located. Whether they survived any significant time after Alexander's departure is unknown, but the act of building them tells you something important about what was happening inside Alexander at the moment he built them. He did not simply turn around. He built a monument to the furthest point reached, which is the act of a man who understood that the furthest point was not a failure, but a fact. Something that needed to be marked because it would be part of how the campaign was remembered, even here. At the moment when his army had told him no for the first time in his adult life as a king, his mind was already on how this moment would be understood by people who were not there. The political reality of what had happened at the Hyphasis was, despite the altars and the careful framing, a defeat of a specific kind, not a military defeat. Alexander had not been beaten by an enemy army. He had been stopped by his own men, by the accumulated weight of 7 years of marching, by the simple and irreducible fact that the people who made the campaign possible had reached their limit, the genius of how he managed the moment, the 3 days in the tent, the unfavourable signs, the altars, the presentation of the withdrawal as a considered decision rather than a capitulation, is visible in the way the ancient sources handle the episode. None of them quite say Alexander was forced to turn back. They say he decided to turn back, which is true in the narrow sense that he made the announcement himself, and which is not quite the whole truth. The thesis that opened tonight's story, the idea that stopping, for Alexander, was a kind of death in itself, meets its first real test at the Hyphasis, and the test reveals something the victories had concealed. That belief was sustainable only as long as the people around him shared enough of it to keep going. When they stopped sharing it, when the army said, quietly and collectively and without violence, that it had reached its limit, the belief had nowhere left to go except inward, and what it did there, in the months that followed the Hyphasis, is something the story will not state directly. It will only show what happened next, and leave the connection where it belongs, with you. The journey back west began in the late summer of 320, 6 BC. Alexander chose a route partly by river, sailing down the Indus toward the sea, and the river journey produced some of the heaviest fighting of the return. The peoples along the Indus who had not submitted found Alexander coming through their territory, and some chose to resist. Among them were a people called the Malians, settled near the confluence of rivers with the Indus, who put up a defense that led to one of the most discussed episodes of the entire campaign. In the assault on the main Malian city, Alexander did something his senior commanders had been trying to prevent him from doing throughout the campaign. He was at the front. He had always been at the front. But at the Malian city he went further than the front. He climbed a scaling ladder himself, was among the first over the wall, and dropped down inside the city with a small number of men before the Macedonian forces could follow in sufficient numbers. He was hit by an arrow. The arrow entered his chest. He went down. The men with him formed a shield over him. The Macedonian forces breached the wall. The city was taken with a ferocity that the sources attribute directly to the terror and fury of an army that had just watched its king fall inside the walls alone. Alexander survived. The wound was serious enough that for days the army did not know whether he would live. Ancient sources record the specific fear that spread through the force during that uncertainty. Not just the personal fear of losing Alexander, but the practical fear of men who were deep in unknown territory, months from the coast, years from home, with no clear line of succession and no obvious alternative command. When he appeared before the army again, the reaction the sources describe: men weeping, reaching to touch him as he passed, crowding around his litter and then his horse, is the reaction of people who had understood, in the days when they did not know if he would live, how completely their situation depended on this one person continuing to breathe. The fleet reached the mouth of the Indus and the shore of the ocean in the late summer of 320, 5 BC. Alexander rode his horse into the surf. He made offerings to the gods. He sailed out past the point where the land was visible and made further offerings there. He had touched the ocean, not the eastern edge he had been aiming for when the campaign began, but an edge. The boundary was real. He had reached it. Whatever he felt standing in the surf at the edge of everything his campaign had reached. The sources do not capture with any fullness. They give us the ritual acts. They give us the offerings. What was behind them? In the mind of a man who had just crossed half the known world and been told by his own army that half was enough, is something the sources leave to the imagination. The man who believed that stopping was a kind of death had been forced to stop at the hyphasis. And then, 3 months later, he had climbed a wall alone into a city under assault and dropped down on the other side without waiting for the men behind him. The story will not draw the line between those two events for you, but it will not pretend the line is not there. The return from the ocean's edge was not a return in the simple sense of retracing steps. Alexander made a decision about how to bring his forces back to the Persian heartland that divided the army into 3 separate elements moving by different routes. And the route he chose for himself was the one that would cost the most. The fleet, under the command of a Cretan officer named Narration, would sail west along the coast of the Arabian Sea, charting unknown waters and establishing whether a sea route between India and the Persian Gulf was viable. A substantial portion of the army would travel by a northern inland route under the command of Granicus, moving through territory that was challenging but known. And Alexander himself would lead the 3rd element through a coastal desert region called Gedrosia, corresponding roughly to what is today the Balochistan region of southwestern Pakistan and southeastern Iran. The region was arid in a way that the word desert does not quite capture, a landscape of sand and rock and dried riverbeds where water was scarce. Shade was non-existent, and the distances between any reliable source of supply were very long. This was not entirely unknown territory in the ancient world. Alexander had access to information about Gedrosia, and that information should have made the route appear extremely difficult under any circumstances. He chose it anyway. The ancient sources offer explanations, and those explanations sit alongside each other without fully resolving into a single clear answer. Arrian records that Alexander was aware of the difficulty, but was moved in part by the example of Cyrus the Great and the legendary Queen Semiramis, both of whom were said to have attempted this crossing and to have lost most of their forces to the desert. The idea that he could succeed where they had failed fits the pattern of behaviour visible throughout the campaign. From the Danube to Granicus to the Hindu Kush, the impossible crossing was itself part of the appeal. There was also a more practical argument. The fleet under Nearchus needed supplies along the coastal route, and a land force moving parallel to the coast could theoretically establish supply depots and maintain contact with the ships. This was a real strategic consideration, not a fabrication to justify a decision already made on other grounds. Both things can be true. The reason can be real and the cost can still be unjustifiable. The march through Gedrosia lasted several weeks. The ancient sources describe it in terms consistent enough across multiple independent accounts to paint a picture that requires no embellishment. The heat was extreme. Water was found at intervals too long for men and animals already depleted by years of campaigning, followed by the Indian campaign and the fighting along the Indus. The food supply, supposed to be supplemented by foraging, proved grossly inadequate for a force moving through terrain that had almost nothing to offer. Pack animals died. The baggage they had been carrying, including supplies, was abandoned. Those too weak to continue were left behind, which in the conditions of Gedrosia meant that they died. Arrian, drawing in part on the account of Nearchus who witnessed portions of the return, records that the losses in Gedrosia were severe. Precise numbers are not recoverable from the ancient sources, which give no consistent figures and which were not working from the kind of systematic casualty accounting a modern military force would maintain. What the sources agree on is the qualitative picture. The march through Gedrosia cost Alexander's army more in human terms than many of the battles of the preceding years, and the cost fell disproportionately on the non-combatants, the camp followers, the support personnel, the families that had accumulated around the army over years of campaigning, who had less resilience than the trained soldiers when conditions became extreme. There is an episode recorded by several ancient sources that gives the suffering of Gedrosia a particular human quality. During the march, in conditions where water was the most precious thing in the world, a small quantity of water was found and brought to Alexander. He was offered it while the men around him had none. He took the vessel in which the water had been brought to him, looked at the men watching, and poured it into the sand. The gesture is reported consistently enough across sources to be generally considered to have some basis in fact, though specific circumstances vary somewhat between accounts. It was the kind of act that armies remember, the kind that becomes part of the story a commander tells about himself, and that soldiers tell about their commander long after the march is over. Whether it reflected genuine feeling or was also calibrated to produce exactly the effect it produced, or was both at once, the sources cannot say. In Alexander, the genuine and the calculated had been trained together at Mieza, and they had never fully come apart. But the gesture did not change the fact that the army was dying in a desert that Alexander had chosen to cross. The coordination with Nearchus's fleet, the most practically defensible justification for the route, was imperfect in ways that the terrain's difficulty made predictable. The supply depots that were supposed to support the fleet were established with mixed success, partly because the local population of Gedrosia had little surplus to provide, and partly because the army itself was consuming everything available simply to survive. Nearchus, when he eventually made contact with Alexander after completing the coastal voyage, found an army in significantly worse condition than the force that had reached the mouth of the Indus months earlier. Most historians who have written about Gedrosia note that it is one of the episodes in Alexander's career where the gap between the narrative he was constructing about himself and the reality of what his decisions cost is most visible. The achievement, to the extent Gedrosia was an achievement, was that Alexander crossed it and emerged with a force still capable of functioning. The cost of that achievement, measured in the people who did not emerge, resists any framing that makes it entirely worthwhile. Gedrosia was many things: a strategic decision with genuine military logic attached to it, a demonstration that he could cross what Cyrus and Semiramis could not, a march that cost lives it did not need to cost, and perhaps also though the sources cannot confirm this and the story will not claim it as certainty. Something that happened in the space where the Hyphases had left him. In the part of the campaign where the forward motion had been interrupted and the return had begun, in the months when the man who believed stopping was a kind of death was, for the first time in his adult life, heading home, he emerged from Gedrosia in the late autumn of 320, 5 BC, and entered the Persian province of Carmania. There were supplies, there was shade, there was water that did not need to be rationed. The contrast with what the army had just crossed was extreme enough that the sources described the arrival in terms suggesting something close to collective relief. A breath held for weeks finally released. What followed in Carmania was an administrative reckoning. During the years Alexander had spent in India and along the Indus, some of the satraps and governors he had left behind had not behaved as expected. Some had been abusing their authority. Some had apparently concluded that Alexander was not coming back, that the eastern campaigns had taken him far enough and long enough that normal accountability no longer applied in practice. They were wrong. Several satraps were removed. Several were executed. The process sent a clear message to every administrator in the empire. Absence from the centre of power was not the same as absence of consequences. Alexander moved back into the Persian heartland, toward Pasargadae, toward Persepolis, toward Susa, carrying with him the army that had survived Gedrosia and the questions that the eastern campaigns had left open. About the empire, about the men who were supposed to govern it, about what came next for a man whose entire adult life had been organised around a campaign that was, in some sense, already over and yet showed no sign of being finished. The water he had poured into the sand was gone the moment it hit the ground. What it left behind, in the men who had watched him pour it, was a story they would carry for the rest of their lives. He understood that. He had always understood that stories were a kind of force, and that the story a commander told about himself mattered as much as the battles he won. He was heading toward Babylon now. There was still a great deal to be done, and not much time left to do it, though no one in the army knew that yet. Not even Alexander. Before Babylon, there was Opis. Opis was a city on the Tigris River, and in the summer of 320, 4 BC, it was the site of the most serious confrontation between Alexander and his Macedonian army since the Hyphasis. The circumstances were different from what had happened at the Hyphasis. At the Hyphasis, the army had refused to go further east. At Opis, the anger was about something else entirely. It was about what Alexander was doing to the army itself, to its composition and its identity and its relationship to the king it had been following for nearly a decade. To understand what happened at Opis, you have to understand what had happened at Susa a few months earlier. The mass wedding at Susa was one of the most extraordinary events of Alexander's reign, and it was understood as significant by everyone who witnessed it. Alexander himself married 2 women, Statira II, the eldest daughter of Darius III, and Parysatis II, the daughter of the Persian king, Artaxerxes III. These were the daughters of the men he had defeated, women whose bloodlines connected him to the Achaemenid dynasty he had destroyed, and whose children would carry both Macedonian and Persian royal ancestry, alongside Alexander. Ancient sources describe roughly 80 of his senior Macedonian and Greek commanders also taking Persian and Iranian wives. In a ceremony conducted according to Persian custom, Alexander paid the wedding expenses for all of them. He also acknowledged and provided for the children his soldiers had fathered with Asian women during the years of the campaign, an acknowledgement that was both humane and practically significant, creating a generation of children with Macedonian military fathers and local mothers who would be raised in the empire's service. The Macedonian soldiers watching understood what it meant. Their king was marrying Persian princesses, their generals were marrying Persian women, and the army was being reorganized to include 30,000 young Persian men, trained in Macedonian weapons and tactics, who were already being called called successors, a name that, to Macedonian ears, sounded less like honour than replacement. When Alexander then announced at Opis that he was discharging the Macedonian veterans who were too old or too badly wounded to continue serving, the discharge that should have been welcome, the long, delayed permission to go home that the men at the hyphasis had been asking for in everything but explicit words, landed instead as the final confirmation of what the soldiers feared. They were being replaced. The Persian soldiers were the new army. The Macedonians who had marched from home 8 years ago were being sent back now that the king had what he needed from them. The reaction at Opis was the most openly hostile the Macedonian army had been since Alexander took the throne. Ancient sources record men shouting, telling Alexander to take his father with him on his next campaign. The reference was to the claim, circulating since Egypt, that Alexander had divine rather than mortal parentage. The insult was direct and personal, aimed precisely at the point where his identity was most complicated, and it came from soldiers who had fought for him at Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela and the Hydaspes. Alexander's response at Opis was not the 3 days of silent withdrawal he had used at the hyphasis. It was immediate and cold. He walked into the crowd, identified the men he considered the ringleaders, pointed them out to his guards, and had them arrested. Then he addressed the assembly. The speech that ancient sources attribute to him at Opis is one of the longest in the ancient record of the campaign. And what makes it worth noting is not its rhetorical skill, but what it reveals about how Alexander understood the relationship between himself and the army he had built his entire life around. He told them what Philip had done for Macedonia before Alexander arrived, what he himself had done for the men standing in front of him, what they had received and what he had kept for himself, which by his account was little beyond the demands of the campaign. He told them that if they wanted to go home, they should go. He dismissed the entire army. He walked away. Then came 3 days that mirrored the hyphasis in structure but not in feeling. At the hyphasis, Alexander had retreated in something that resembled grief. At Opis, he retreated in something that resembled controlled anger. He spent those 3 days conducting business only with Persian officers, appointing Persians to positions that had previously been held by Macedonians, treating the Persian court as his court in a way that was visible and deliberate and clearly aimed at making the Macedonian soldiers understand what their absence would actually mean. On the 3rd day, senior Macedonian officers came to his door and asked to be received. They were weeping. According to the ancient sources, they asked to be forgiven. Alexander came out. What followed was a reconciliation that the ancient sources describe in terms emphasizing its emotional intensity. Men embracing. A king moved alongside his soldiers. The immediate rupture apparently healed, but ruptures of this kind do not heal completely. The reconciliation at Opis was genuine in the sense that the confrontation was resolved. The men arrested were released, and the army came back together as a functioning institution. It was not genuine in the sense of restoring what had existed before, which was itself already very different from what had crossed the Hellespont. The army that moved with Alexander toward Babylon in the autumn of 320 4 BC was an army that had twice, at the hyphasis and at Opis, shown him something about its limits that he had absorbed without fully accepting. Then came Hephaestion. Hephaestion died at Ecbatana in the autumn of 320 4 BC. He had been ill, had seemed to be recovering, and then died suddenly. The ancient sources describe Alexander's response with a consistency across multiple accounts that gives a clear picture even where specific details vary. He lay with the body for an extended period before he could be persuaded to leave it. He ordered the manes of all horses and mules in the army cut as a sign of mourning. He ordered the battlements of the city walls of Ecbatana torn down. He sent to the oracle at Siwa to ask whether Hephaestion should be honoured as a god or as a hero. Distinct categories in Greek religious thought with different ritual implications, and the oracle returned an answer that permitted the honours of a hero. He began planning a funeral monument on a scale that, if the ancient sources' descriptions are accurate, would have been among the most spectacular structures of the ancient world. The monument was never built. What the ancient sources cannot tell us with confidence is precisely what Hephaestion was to Alexander. The sources do not agree, and the question is genuinely open. And this story will not pretend to answer what the sources cannot. What the behaviour over 20 years says is this: Hephaestion was not simply a general or an advisor, though he became both. He was the person who had been present since Mieza, since before the Hellespont, since before any of it, the person Alexander seems to have trusted with things he did not share with the others. Whatever the precise nature of that relationship, the loss of Hephaestion took something out of Alexander that the months between Ecbatana and Babylon never restored. Then came Babylon. He arrived in the winter of 320, 4 to 320, 3 BC. Babylon was the greatest city in the empire in terms of population and commercial importance, and it was where Alexander intended to base the next phase of operations. He had plans. The ancient sources record them in enough detail to give a picture of a man who, even after everything, had not stopped planning forward. The Arabian campaign was the most concrete of these plans, and its foundations in the preparations Alexander was actually making are solid enough that most historians consider it genuinely intended. He had ships being built and assembled in the Persian Gulf. He had sent reconnaissance missions along the Arabian coast. Arabia was wealthy and strategically positioned and not yet under any authority he recognized, and that combination was, by his established pattern of behavior, sufficient reason to plan an expedition beyond Arabia. The ancient sources record ambitions that are harder to evaluate. Some mention intentions to explore the Caspian Sea. Some record plans extending toward Carthage and the western Mediterranean. These further ambitions appear in sources that are not always the most reliable for the specific details of Alexander's planning, and historians treat them with varying degrees of confidence. What can be said is that the plans for Arabia were real, and that they were consistent with a man who had not finished, who could not finish, because finishing would require deciding that there was a point beyond which the campaign did not go, and that was a decision the entire shape of his life had made impossible to reach. Then came the fever. In late May or early June of 320, 3 BC, Alexander attended a banquet given by a Macedonian officer named Medius of Larissa. He drank heavily, as he had been doing with increasing frequency in the months since Hephaestion's death. He left the banquet and developed a fever. The fever did not break. What happened over the following 12 days is recorded in a document known as the Royal Diaries, or Ephemerides, which ancient sources cite as a day-by-day account of Alexander's final illness. The document is quoted or summarized by Arrian and Plutarch in ways that give it some credibility as an actual record. Though historians debate its reliability and the extent to which it may have been altered after the fact, the picture it gives is of a progressive deterioration. Alexander continued to conduct business for several days, receiving officers, giving instructions about the Arabian expedition, maintaining the appearance of a king in command of his situation. Then he could no longer speak. He was moved to a location where the army could file past him, and he acknowledged them as they came, raising his head or his hand. Ancient sources record that the soldiers who filed past were weeping. He died in early June of 320, 3 BC. He was 30, 2 years old. The cause of his death has been debated for more than 2,000 years. Typhoid fever, complicated by other factors, is among the most commonly cited modern assessments. Though other possibilities have been proposed, and the ancient sources themselves do not give a diagnosis that translates cleanly into modern medical categories, the possibility of poisoning was raised by some ancient sources and has been discussed by modern ones. Though most historians who have examined the question carefully consider natural illness the more likely explanation, a definitive answer is probably not recoverable from the evidence that survives, and this story will not pretend otherwise. What happened in the room in Babylon as Alexander lay dying, and what happened after he died, is recorded by ancient sources in ways that capture the political dimension of the moment with a clarity the medical details lack. The question of succession, which Alexander had never answered directly, which he had deflected and ignored and simply not addressed in any formal way that could be acted upon, was present in the room before he had finished dying. When he was asked who should receive his ring, his seal of authority, the ancient sources record that he said, or was believed to have said, that it should go to the strongest. In Greek the word is kratisto. Some sources add that he also said he foresaw great funeral games among his friends. by which he meant the competitions among his successors that he apparently understood would follow his death. Whether he actually said these things, or whether the words were attributed to him later by people who had reasons for presenting his last wishes in particular ways, is a question the sources cannot definitively settle. What is not a question is what happened immediately after. The men who had been his generals and companions began positioning themselves in relation to the void his death had created before the body was cold. The body of Alexander was not buried quickly. Ancient sources record that it remained unburied for several days while the succession crisis absorbed the attention of everyone around it. The Babylonian priests who examined it noted, according to some sources, that it showed no signs of corruption, a detail the tradition transmitted as significant, as a mark of the nature of the person who had died. Eventually the body was placed in a golden sarcophagus and preparations began to move it toward Macedonia. It never arrived. Ptolemy, who had been one of Alexander's closest companions since before the Hellespont, intercepted the funeral cortege in Syria and redirected it to Egypt, where Alexander was eventually buried in Alexandria, the city he had founded on the Egyptian coast in 330, 1 BC. The man who had visited Troy before the campaign began, who had made offerings at the tomb of Achilles, who had slept with the Iliad under his pillow, ended up buried in the city he had founded, in a land that was not his, far from the Macedonia he had left at 21 and never seen again. The funeral games he had predicted began before the body reached its resting place. They would last for decades. Alexander left no memoir. That fact is worth sitting with before anything else, because it shapes everything that follows in a way that is easy to forget when the story is being told. The man who crossed half the known world, who was present at battles and sieges and decisions that changed the course of history, left behind no account of any of it in his own words, no diary, no letters verified as authentic beyond fragments reported by later writers, no history commissioned during his lifetime that survives. What we have instead are voices that arrived late, sometimes centuries late, carrying memories already handled by ambition and loyalty and philosophy, and the simple passage of time. This is not a minor complication. It is the central problem of knowing Alexander, and it is worth naming clearly before the story ends. The source that most historians of Alexander's campaigns rely on most heavily is a writer named Lucius Flavius Arrianus, known as Arrian, who wrote his account of Alexander's campaigns in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Arrian was writing approximately 400 years after the events he described. He was a Greek-speaking Roman official who had served as a governor, and who brought to his history both a genuine effort at systematic research and a set of intellectual commitments that shaped what he emphasized and how he interpreted what he found. What made Arrian's account valuable, and what he himself emphasizes in his introduction, is his choice of sources. Rather than relying on the more sensational accounts that had accumulated around Alexander in the centuries since his death, Arrian chose to build his narrative primarily on 2 men who had actually been there. The first was Ptolemy, one of Alexander's closest companions since before the Hellespont, who after Alexander's death became the ruler of Egypt and founded the dynasty that would last until Cleopatra. The second was Aristobulus, a Greek who had been part of the campaign and who wrote his own account in old age. These were not neutral sources. Ptolemy had political reasons for presenting Alexander and the campaign in particular ways, reasons connected to his own legitimacy as ruler of Egypt and his position in the wars of succession that followed. Aristobulus was writing as an old man about events he had experienced when younger. With all the distortions that memory and retrospective meaning making introduce over time, Arrian knew this, or knew versions of it, and tried to account for it, but knowing that your sources are partial does not make them impartial. It only means you can read their partiality with some awareness of what it is. What Arrian gives us is a narrative of the military campaigns that is more careful and more internally consistent than most of what preceded it. When Arrian describes a battle, he is describing it with the background of genuine military experience, which gives his account a plausibility of detail that more purely literary accounts lack. What Arrian does not give us is a full picture of Alexander as a person, the interior life, the emotional texture, the experience of what it actually felt like to be inside that campaign, is mostly absent from Arrian. He tells you what Alexander did. He tells you much less about what Alexander was. For that, you turn to Plutarch. Plutarch wrote his life of Alexander as part of a collection of paired biographies, matching a Greek figure with a Roman one for the purpose of moral reflection. He was writing at roughly the same time as Arrian, also in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and he drew on a wider range of sources, including sources now entirely lost. He says himself, in his introduction to the life of Alexander, that he is not writing history but biography, and that biography is interested in the signs of character that appear in small actions and words rather than in the great military engagements. Plutarch was interested in the kind of person Alexander was, in moral significance, in the small gesture that reveals what the larger record might obscure. That is not a flaw. It is a different kind of source, valuable for different reasons, requiring a different kind of reading. Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century BC, provides a third perspective. He drew on earlier sources, including a historian named Plutarch, who wrote in the generation after Alexander and who had a reputation for dramatic storytelling over strict accuracy. Diodorus's account has more colour and more narrative detail in some places than Arrian's, and historians use it where it provides information the more careful sources do not. But it requires more caution. Think of it this way. You are trying to understand something that happened in a room 400 years ago, using the notes of someone who was not there, drawing on the memoirs of people who were there but who had reasons to remember it a particular way, filtered through centuries of copying and editing and the slow drift of meaning that every transmitted document undergoes. That is the situation the ancient sources put us in. It is not a comfortable situation for anyone who wants certainty, but it is the situation we are actually in. And the honest response to it is not to pretend we know more than we do. What the sources tell us with enough consistency to be broadly reliable, a man named Alexander, son of Philip of Macedonia, lived from 350, 6 BC to 320, 3 BC. He became king at 20. He crossed into Asia with an army of roughly 40,000 men and did not stop crossing until his army stopped him at the Hyphasis River. He won battles at Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela and the Hydaspes. He took Tyre and Gaza and Persepolis and Babylon. He went into Bactria and Sogdia and India. He came back through the Gadrosian desert. He died in Babylon with plans still being made and an empire that had no one else who could hold it. What the sources do not tell us with any confidence what Alexander thought in the 3 days he spent in his tent at the Hyphasis, what he felt when he stood in the surf at the edge of the ocean, whether the burning of Persepolis was a decision or an accident, what he meant when he said, if he said it, that the empire should go to the strongest. Those questions live in the spaces between the sources. They are real questions about a real person. They simply cannot be answered with the certainty that the legend of Alexander has often been presented with. The honest position is to hold them as open, as genuinely unresolved, as things that the distance of more than 2,000 years has placed beyond our certain reach. The voices reach us from a long way off, carrying things we cannot fully inventory. The best we can do is listen carefully, note where they disagree, and resist the temptation to resolve the disagreements in ways the evidence does not support. Alexander left no memoir. What he left instead was everything else. And the question of what that everything else means has not stopped being asked in all the time since the fever came and would not leave. Alexander died in Babylon in early June of 320, 3 BC, and within hours, the world he had built began the process of coming apart. This is not a retrospective judgment made with the benefit of distance. It was understood immediately by the men in the room. The question of what happened next, of who would hold the empire and under what authority and in whose name, was present before the body was cold. The men asking it were not strangers to power. They were the generals and companions who had been with Alexander for years. Men of genuine ability and genuine ambition, who had been operating for a decade in the shadow of a personality so dominant that their own ambitions had had almost nowhere to go. The shadow was gone, and what had been suppressed by it came into the open with a speed that tells you something important about how much pressure it had been under. The immediate succession produced a compromise that satisfied no one and resolved nothing. Alexander's half-brother, a man named Philip Aridaeus, was named king as Philip III. The child that Roxana was carrying, who would be born a few months after Alexander's death as Alexander IV, was named co-king. Neither of these kings would exercise real power. Philip Aridaeus would be killed in 317 BC. Alexander IV would be killed in 310 or 309 BC, before he was old enough to rule in any meaningful sense. The children and the half-brother were not kings in any functional way. They were symbols of continuity deployed by men who wanted continuity to mean their own continued authority. The men who actually held power in the years after Alexander's death are known in the historical tradition as the Diadochi, a Greek word meaning successors. They were the generals who had commanded portions of Alexander's army and who had been appointed as governors of various parts of the empire. Ptolemy took Egypt and held it. Seleucus, who had commanded the companion cavalry at Gaugamela and who would prove one of the most capable of the successors, eventually established control over the eastern portions of the empire. Cassander controlled Macedonia itself. Antigonus controlled much of Asia Minor. Lysimachus held Thrace. These men fought each other, allied with each other against common enemies, betrayed each other, and fought each other again across many decades. The wars of the Diadochi were not a brief transition between Alexander's empire and what came after. They were a sustained period of conflict lasting in its various phases from Alexander's death in 320 BC well into the early decades of the 3rd century BC, a span of time in which the map of the ancient world was redrawn repeatedly, and in which the human cost of inheriting an empire designed for one person became fully visible. By the time the situation stabilized into something resembling a new order, what had existed under Alexander, a single empire under a single authority, was gone. In its place were several large kingdoms, each ruled by a Macedonian dynasty, each governing a portion of the territory Alexander had taken, each drawing on Macedonian military tradition and Greek cultural forms while administering populations that were largely not Greek and not Macedonian. These are the kingdoms known to history as the Hellenistic kingdoms, and they would define the political and cultural landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean and the Near East for the following 2 centuries, until Roman expansion absorbed them one by one. The kingdom of the Ptolemies in Egypt lasted the longest, ending when Cleopatra VII died in 30 BC. More than 2.5 centuries after Alexander founded the city on the Egyptian coast that bore his name, the Seleucid kingdom in Syria and the East lasted in various forms until the 1st century BC. The kingdom of Macedonia itself was absorbed by Rome in 168 BC, less than 2 centuries after Alexander had left it. The cities Alexander founded, scattered across the territories of the former Persian Empire, from Egypt to the edges of the Indian subcontinent, persisted in many cases long after the political structures that created them dissolved. Alexandria in Egypt became one of the great cities of the ancient world, a centre of learning and commerce and cultural exchange that brought together Greek and Egyptian and Jewish and eventually Roman influences in ways that shaped the intellectual history of the following centuries. The library at Alexandria, founded by the Ptolemies, became the closest thing the ancient world had to a systematic attempt to gather human knowledge in one place. Other cities founded in Alexander's name or in imitation of his practice left marks across Central Asia that persisted for generations. The name Kandahar is often connected by modern scholars with this Alexandrian legacy, though the exact continuity of the name across the intervening centuries remains a matter of debate among historians. The spread of Greek language and culture across the territories of Alexander's former empire, the phenomenon historians call the Hellenistic period, was in some respects his most durable legacy, not the political empire, which did not survive his death as a unified entity, not the military conquests, most of which had to be renegotiated or reconquered by his successors, but the cultural diffusion, the spread of Greek as a language of administration and commerce and thought across a vast territory, The mixing of Greek and local artistic and religious and philosophical traditions that produced something genuinely new in the places where it happened. Alexander did not primarily set out to spread Greek culture as a conscious civilizational project. He set out to conquer, to win, to go further than anyone before him. To reach the ocean, the cultural diffusion was a consequence of the conquest rather than its purpose. And it happened through processes Alexander did not control, and that continued long after he was gone. The Hellenistic spread of Greek helped create the linguistic world in which later Jewish and Christian texts, including the New Testament, could circulate widely across cultures and boundaries in ways that would not have been possible before Alexander's campaigns, helped spread a common Greek linguistic framework across much of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East. What he did plan, to the extent that he planned anything beyond the next campaign, was always oriented toward the military and the immediate. The administrative structures he built were provisional, designed to function while he was present and moving, not to maintain themselves in his absence. The governors he appointed were answerable to him personally rather than to an institutional system that could survive him. The army was loyal to him in ways that did not automatically transfer to successors who had not been there at Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela. This is the thing the empire's rapid dissolution reveals most clearly about how it was built. An empire designed for one person is not an empire in the sense of a durable political institution. It is an expression of one person's will, very large and very fast and very far, reaching, and when that will is gone, the expression dissolves back into the reality that was always underneath it, the reality of competing interests and regional powers and the human tendency to pursue advantage when the force suppressing that tendency is removed. Alexander was that force. He was the thing holding it together, and he had never built anything else to do that job in his place, because building something else would have required acknowledging that the job would someday need to be done without him, which would have required acknowledging that he would someday be gone. And Alexander, who had slept with Achilles under his pillow and ridden into battle at the front and dropped down alone inside the walls of the Malian city, had not built his life around the acknowledgement of limits. The campaign proved what he had believed since Mieza, that a man willing to go further than anyone expected, further than the situation required, further than his own generals advised, could cross distances that had no name in the geography he had started with. He proved it at Granicus, and at the Danube, and at Gaugamela, and at the Hindu Kush. He proved it in the surf at the mouth of the Indus. He very nearly proved it at the Hyphasis, and would have, except that the people he needed to prove it with had reached the place where they could not go further. That is where the story ends. Not at the Hyphasis. Not in the desert of Gedrosia. Not in the surf at the edge of the ocean. It ends in a bed. In Babylon. With a fever and an empire and a room full of men already calculating what came next. The question that remains, the one that has been sitting underneath everything since the opening, is not whether Alexander was great. That question is too simple and has been answered too many times, in too many contradictory directions to have much left in it. The question is what it costs to be the kind of person who cannot stop, what it costs the person, and what it costs everyone around them. What kind of world such a person leaves behind when the stopping finally comes from outside, from a fever in the night in a city far from home, because it was never going to come from inside. That question does not resolve cleanly. It did not resolve in 323 BC, and it has not resolved in the time since. It is the kind of question that stays open after the story is over, that surfaces in the quiet moments, that asks something of you without being entirely clear about what. The room is dark. The story is finished. Let it stay with you as you sleep.